Okay, we're recording now, ready to go.
Okay, right. Well, I was asked to speak about the Agape Feast. And I'm going to read a short passage of scripture. But before I do that, I want to ask a rhetorical question. And that rhetorical question is this: how did Jesus come into this world? And there are many answers to that question, and doubtless many of them are true. But there is one particular answer to that question that I'm thinking about today. And that's in Matthew chapter 11, verses 18 and 19. And this is what it says. And it says, "For John came neither eating nor drinking, and they say he has a demon. The Son of Man came eating and drinking, and they say, behold, a gluttonous man and a drunkard, a friend of tax gatherers and sinners. Yet wisdom is vindicated by her deeds." So what we have to understand, what I'm trying to point out here is that, Jesus came eating and drinking. John came fasting. Jesus came eating and drinking. Can you see me okay there?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, it's just that the screen has gone blank, and I just wanted to make sure everything was connected okay.
I'll fix it.
Yeah, hit that. Yeah, that's it.
Oh, all right. All right. Okay. That's perhaps a bit better for me. So Jesus came eating and drinking. Now, there's only one direct reference to the term Agape Feast in the Bible, and that's in Jude chapter 1, verse 12, where it speaks about people coming in to their Agape Feasts who shouldn't really be there. But although the term is only used there, what it's referring to is there throughout the New Testament. And it's clear from what other authors say in the New Testament that the Agape Feast, it was the thing they did. It was one of the most important things they did together.
Stephen, I just wanted to clarify, it's Agape Feast for us.
Yes. Sorry, what do you want to clarify?
Just that the word agape is what we say agape, you say something different.
Oh, sorry. Right, I say agape, yes. Agape Feast, or I say agape, but my accent is a broad Yorkshire accent from Britain, so yes, sorry about that. The Agape Feast. You're probably right. It's probably my pronunciation that's wrong. But yes, the feast, the meal that the Christians had together, which was called the Agape Feast, or Agape Feast as I call it. And it's described throughout the New Testament. It's also very clear from references outside the New Testament that this was the practice of the church. And it's very clear that the Agape Feast in the early church, the Agape Feast, you're going to have to forgive me, I get into the habit of saying it that way. The Agape Feast in the early church was the Lord's Supper. There was no distinction between this Agape Feast and the Lord's Supper. And the historians admit this. If you look it up, they admit at the beginning it was all the same thing. There was no distinction between what's called the Eucharist and the feast. Now, Eucharist means to give thanks. And it got called the Eucharist when the bread and the wine was separated out from the meal itself with this ritualistic thanksgiving that they did. And the meal eventually, it took some time, but the meal eventually got separated out. But at the beginning, it was all the same thing. It was the Christians meeting together. And it was separated out eventually for ritual treatment. But at the time, in the early church, it wasn't a ritual in the sense that we think of it. We could say, well, yes, they did this. There was a particular thing they did together. It depends how you define ritual. But it wasn't a ritual that was performed and protected by a priest. It was actually a meal together. it was not a ritual performance in a cultic space, which is what it eventually became. It was, in fact, a fellowship meal, and it was a feast in celebration of the salvation that we have in the Lord Jesus Christ. And it's clear that if we look at Scripture as a whole, there are many antecedents to this, but one in particular that's very important. If we look through the Old Testament, for example, eating is very important. You read the Old Testament, as you read it, you become aware of the importance of eating together. It's not just for the sustaining of the body. I mean, it's that as well, but it's much richer than that. It's fellowship. It has significance. Eating together in the Bible is very important. But the Passover is the real paradigm for the Agape Feast or the Lord's Supper. Now, there are lots of other eating that went on in the Bible, and all those occasions of eating, they play into our understanding of the Agape Feast and the Passover. But the Passover itself is the most important of these antecedents. And that's why we, or at least I say, and I think many would agree, that really the Lord's Supper is the Christian Passover. Christ celebrated the Last Supper, and that was the last Jewish Passover, really. The next one was the Christian Passover. All that was promised in the Passover, the Jewish Passover, was fulfilled when Christ died and rose from the grave. And therefore, there was a transition from the Jewish Passover, which pointed to Christ, to the Christian Passover, which was a celebration of what he came and did once and for all time. No more shedding of blood after that for the salvation of sins. Everything that all the animal sacrifices pointed to were fulfilled in him. And therefore, when we have the Lord's Supper, Jesus said, do this in remembrance of me. So it's also, if you read the New Testament, it's equally important. Eating together is equally important in the New Testament. Jesus is always eating with his disciples and with other people. And at the Last Supper, he says, as often as you do this, that is, as often as you eat together, do this in remembrance of me. So that's Luke 22, verse 19. And of course, Paul's description of it in 1 Corinthians 11, 24 to 25. Breaking bread is frequently mentioned as the activity of Christians, and they were to do this in remembrance of Christ. As often as they did it, they were to do it in remembrance of him. So the Bible has a lot of references to this. It doesn't say Agape Feast except in Jude 1:2, but it does imply, it is referring to the same thing. And it's this remembering Christ and having a meal together. Now, you might say, well, why is eating so important? And it really is important. As you read if you read the whole Bible from beginning to end, you see just how important eating is in both Old and New Testaments. And the thing is that eating is fellowship. It's not just, when we eat together, we have fellowship. But the Lord's Supper is more than that. It's fellowship at the Lord's table together with his people. And therefore, it is the Christian Passover. We look back to what Christ did. We have a meal at the Lord's table in fellowship with each other. And we celebrate our salvation through his sacrifice once and for all. And it is a feast. It's the Lord's Supper. It's a meal. When we go into church and we have a cube of bread and or a wafer with the exciting taste of cardboard, if you've ever been in the Church of England, they give you a wafer. And you have a little sip. At least you do get the real stuff in the Church of England with the wine, though, it has to be said. They use fortified wine. This is really reductionist. It's not what Jesus was talking about, and it's not what the early church did. what's practiced today in what they call the Eucharist is not really what the New Testament is talking about, and it's not what the early church did. It's become a highly ritualized thing, and it's the early church. It wasn't administered by a priest. It didn't require a priest to be there. People went and ate together. They didn't require some kind of minister or elder. They did this. They broke bread. They ate together. There is no suggestion in the New Testament that this is something that only could be done with the bishop there. By the year 150 AD, roughly, no, maybe a bit earlier than that, that's what was beginning to happen. So Ignatius of Antioch, for example, said, do nothing without the bishop. The bishop almost took over, in many respects, from Christ as the one who had to be there for everything. That's not in the New Testament, and it wasn't in the early church. Now, we have to deal with some misconceptions about this, because there are some very strong misconceptions about what the Lord's Supper is. And it's often called the Eucharist. Now, Eucharist is a word that means thanksgiving, because when the bread and the wine are taken, some thanksgiving is given for that. And so that bread and wine ritual got called the Eucharist. And at that point, you see that a term is given for it that is different to the Agape Feast. Sorry. And there's a history to this that needs to be understood, and that sometimes isn't. And when we look at the early church and see what was happening, a number of things happened that led to misconceptions later on. And one of these was the idea that the Eucharist, the thanksgiving and the little bit of bread and wine, that was separated from the meal, from the Agape Feast. And that was done very early on. That's the misconception, that it was done very early on. It wasn't. But the reason for this is that a particular event happened in Bithynia, which is northern Turkey, at around the time of about 110 AD. And there was a guy called Pliny the Younger, and he was the Roman governor of Bithynia. And the Roman emperor at the time was a guy called Trajan, and he was emperor from 97 to 117. Pliny died in 113, so it would have been round about 110, something like that, that this letter got written. Now, the background to this is that the faith had become so strong in the area of Bithynia, probably due to Paul's preaching in Asia Minor, that it had begun to disrupt aspects of the local culture. So, for example, the pagan temples were being neglected. And the meat that was produced for the sacrifices in the pagan temples was becoming unsaleable. And, you get little bits, things like this happened in the New Testament when they were in Ephesus, and, they complained that, oh, well, this is going to damage this Christian faith is going to damage the local trade in idols that they were making. Well, yes, it would, and it did. So the Christian faith transforms culture. This is the point. So at that time, this was happening. And when Pliny the Younger got there, he attempted to deal with the predominance of the Christian faith there by banning some of the things that they did. And he found that there were so many Christians that it was problematic. One of the reasons was he couldn't really find anything evil that they were doing. He was telling them to cease their practices, and yet they weren't really doing anything wrong. So he wrote to Trajan, and in this letter, he tells them that there are these people, the Christians. If he's told them to renounce their faith, they won't do, or at least not all of them. And so some of them he's put to death. But the problem is he couldn't find out what the problem was, why they had to be put to death. They weren't doing anything wrong. So he examined some of these. I suspect that means they examined them under torture to find out what they believed. And he wrote to Trajan and said, this is what they believe. What am I supposed to do? And he'd been sent as well anonymous letters saying such and such is a Christian and such is a Christian, giving him lists of people who were Christian, anonymous, and they wanted these Christians persecuted, and he wasn't comfortable with that. And also Trajan wrote back and said, no, don't accept anonymous lists like that. But he wrote to Trajan for advice, and this is what he said. He said that these Christians on a certain day in the week gathered before dawn to sing a hymn to Christ as unto God, and to give a promise to obey certain laws. In other words, not to steal, not to defraud, not to commit adultery. In other words, the 10 Commandments. And then he said, after dark, they met again to have a meal together, consisting of food of an ordinary or innocent kind. Now, before dawn and after dusk refers to the fact that this was a work day. It wasn't, this was their Lord's day, but it wasn't a rest day. Many of them might not have had rest days. I don't know. Some of them would have been slaves. But they met on a certain day, and in the morning, they met to sing a hymn and to promise to obey certain moral precepts. They met again in the evening, and they had an ordinary meal together. Now, the problem is that the word that Pliny wrote, the word that Pliny used to describe this promise in the morning, was the Latin word sacramentum. And sacramentum, what he's describing is, it meant an oath. At the time, sacramentum meant an oath. And what he's describing is that the Christians got together early in the morning on this particular day, which would have been the Lord's Day, and they took an oath to keep God's commandments. But the word sacramentum would not have been the word that the Bithynians themselves used, because Greek was the common language of the Roman Empire, or it may have been some other more local dialect, I don't know. But it wouldn't have been Latin. That would have been Pliny's translation of what he understood they were doing in order to write to Trajan at Rome about what they were doing. Now, the word sacramentum is an interesting word. It originally meant a sum of money deposited by a Roman who went to court. So if two Romans went to court, they would both have to supply a sacramentum, and that was a sum of money, and it was deposited with one of the Tresviri Capitales, the 3 chief men of the city, and it was deposited probably in a sacred place, which is why it was called sacramentum. And the one who lost his case, the one who was found against in the court, he lost his sacramentum. The other guy got his sacramentum back. The guy who won the case got his sacramentum back. The guy who lost his sacramentum, his sum of money that he had to deposit, was then used to defray the costs of the public works and the temples. And that's what the word sacramentum originally meant. But it later came to mean an oath. So it was a promise to do something. That's the word. That's how the word developed. So there was a sacramentum gladiatorum. This was an oath or promise that the gladiators took when they went into the arena or became gladiators. There was also an initial oath that legionaries took when they became members of the army, the legion, and that was called a sacramentum. But it wasn't exclusively used of the legionaries. It was used in a number of ways, but it basically meant an oath, a promise to do something. But the important point is it was Pliny's word. It wasn't the Bithynian Christians' word. That was the word he used to write to Trajan to say, this is what they're doing. On the morning, they meet together and they promise to do certain things, not to defraud, not to steal, not to murder, blah, 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 blah. In other words, they got together and promised to keep God's 10 commandments. So the meaning of the term at the time of Pliny, when this was written, was not the meaning that attached to the word in later ecclesiastical usage, which was an outward sign of an invisible grace. Okay, now that meaning didn't come until the church got hold of the word and gave it its own meaning. And the first person to use the word sacramentum in that way was Tertullian in the beginning of the 3rd century. So not until 100 years later was the word sacrament used in the way that we think of it today. It just wasn't. It didn't mean that. It meant an oath, a promise to do something. Now, what happened then was that later on, later theologians started reading back into earlier times the later ecclesiastical meaning of the word sacramentum. So they would look at Pliny's letter and say, oh, they had the sacrament in the morning and the meal in the evening. And when they saw the word sacramentum, they started interpreting that to mean the Eucharist, the thanksgiving, the bread and the wine. But that's not what Pliny meant. But this later meaning was read back in to the earlier practice, though they said, oh, well, even by 110 AD, the bread and the wine had got separated from the Agape Feast. It was separate. But it's a misunderstanding. It wasn't separate. The sacramentum was an oath to obey God's commandments. Now, I find this interesting. I wonder what the majority of pastors would say if you said, in the morning, you should be promising to obey God's commandments. I suspect that would cause quite a bit of a stir. When I go around and listen, when I go around the churches here, I hardly ever hear any ethical teaching anymore at all. Certainly, I don't hear the 10 Commandments read, not even in the Church of England. They will read the 2 Commandments summary, but not the 10 Commandments. And at the time of Elizabeth I, the law was that the 10 Commandments had to be read out in the liturgy every Sunday, and they had to be on big boards in the church so everybody could read them, along with the Paternoster and something else I can't remember. But certainly in most Anglican churches, those big boards with the 10 Commandments have been taken down now. Not all. You sometimes find one with them still up. And when I find that, I usually take a photograph of it and put it on my Facebook page. But it's not very often.
Stephen,
Yeah.
would you restate Tertullian's description of sacramentum?
Well, yes. Okay.
Or how
He
you
started. Yes. It came to be defined as the outward sign of an inward grace.
Yes.
And it was Tertullian who first used the word in that sense. And his dates are 155 AD to 220. But he didn't use the word in that sense till later on. It wasn't until the beginning of the 3rd century that he used it in that sense. So in the early days, he used it just in the sense of to mean an oath. And that definition is a definition that stayed with sacrament ever since, an outward sign of an inward grace. But that's not what it meant at the time of Pliny's letter. So later theologians started reading back into the term sacramentum, thinking it meant Eucharist for the thanksgiving for the supper. But the supper was had in the evening, so they assumed they were separated out. They were eventually separated out, but not that early. And so this kind of misunderstanding helped to propagate this idea that you could have the Lord's Supper without a meal. It was just a ritual. And the church was increasingly subject to a ritualization. The faith became more and more ritualized. And this was highly problematic. But the problem is, it's an anachronistic interpretation of what the Lord's Supper is, because you're reading back a later meaning into the text of the letter. And this happens as well with the Bible. Later technical theological meanings are often read back into words. So, for example, another word that gets this is diakonos, which means servant. But the problem is, if you read every occurrence in the New Testament of the word diakonos, servant, to mean deacon in the sense that we mean in the church, you're going to have problems, because the civil magistrate is called a servant of God. Does that mean he's a deacon in the church? Well, no, it doesn't. So you've got to be careful how you read things. Technical meanings that are attributed to a word later on can't be read anachronistically back into history without problems. But this is what happened, and so it strengthened this idea that the actual sacrament was not the same as the meal. But that's not the case. The meal, the Thanksgiving was a thanksgiving for the meal. But eventually it got all separated out into a little bit of bread and a wafer, and the Thanksgiving, the ritual, and the meal got eventually neglected. So the sacramentum at the time of Pliny meant a promise, and as the Lord's people met on a Lord's Day morning, what that meant was they promised to obey God's commandments. Now, it's quite well known, but now the other thing is, you've got to remember, once you've got a ritual, you need a priest to guard it. So this whole thing developed along with the increasing ritualization of the Christian faith. And it's quite well known today, but let's say at least among theologians, that this understanding of the word sacramentum in Pliny's letter to Trajan is quite anachronistic. It's known that is not what is meant, that they had the sacrament in the morning, and yet the church still perpetuates this idea that the Lord's Supper is this thanksgiving for a little bit of bread and a little bit of wine, and the idea that the Agape Feast or the love feast was something different, because this ritualization of the faith has carried on. It's carried on throughout history. The Reformation did many good things. I don't want you to think I'm knocking the Reformation, but it didn't solve this problem. It didn't even go anywhere near solving it. The Reformation came out, the Reformers came out with a very good covenantal doctrine of baptism, okay, which was an improvement, but they didn't do the same for the Lord's Supper. In fact, even Calvin himself said that there is no difference between us and the Catholics in what is received at the Lord's Supper. We receive the flesh of Christ, the whole flesh of Christ. The only difference is in the manner of reception. This is what Calvin said. He said, they believe that Christ comes down into the bread and wine. We believe that we're mystically transported up into the heavenlies and there receive Christ's flesh. Now, the problem with that is it's not a covenantal view of the Lord's Supper, and both baptism and the Lord's Supper are covenant signs. They're not sacraments. Right. The sacrament is a concept that wasn't invented until the earliest, in the early 3rd century. Sorry?
We're agreeing with you.
We're agreeing with you.
Oh, right. Okay. So, all right then. Well, so it was early in the church, the Lord's Supper was the meal. Okay. Obviously, Thanksgiving was given, but it was the meal. By the year 600, the two had been separated out. And what had happened was that this ritualization, you see, it's very difficult to control a lot of people eating a meal together. It's not difficult to control ritually what we call the sacrament, this ritual of bread and wine. By the year 600, 2 church councils had banned the celebration of the Agape Feast in church buildings. The first time they banned it, it didn't seem to have had any effect. But the second time they banned it, shortly after that, the Agape Feast ceased really to happen. And it just became what we call the communion, you know, the Eucharist, the bread and the wine. And this is a great problem because there was an historian, Gerard Olhorn, in his book Christian Unity in the Ancient Church, and he said that it was on the Agape Feast especially that the family-like unity of the church had been impressed. It was really important. This Agape, this meal together, was really important in solidifying the unity of the church as a family, the family of God, the adopted family of God, and that it helped to make it what it was as a community. But ritualization moved it away from being a community to a set of rituals performed in church and increasingly performed by the priest. Now, the problem is that this is an undoing of Christ's command to celebrate the Lord's Supper. When he gave us that command, he wasn't thinking of what we do in church today. He was thinking of eating. That's what it meant. The Passover of the Jews was a meal, and it was a meal celebrated with your family and your neighbors. So it's very important that we understand the true meaning of what the Lord's Supper. In fact, the church really abandoned the Lord's Supper and it replaced it with a man-made ritual that could be controlled by priests and also used as a means of control by priests, a means of controlling the church. So I believe that it's very important that we restore the Agape Feast. It will significantly contribute to the fellowship of believers as being really a family together. I want to say now, I wrote a short book about this called The Christian Passover, Agape Feast or Ritual Abuse, because I think what we should be doing is celebrating the Christian Passover, and it's been turned into a ritual abuse.
Is that book available, Stephen?
No, well, it's available as a PDF, free of charge, but there are no more hard copies. But it's easy. You only have to go to the Kuiper Foundation website and download it as a PDF. There's only 56 pages in it. It's a short book, but it deals with this whole thing about how the misunderstanding about the word sacrament came about. And it deals with, also what happens in church today. So you can go there. It's www.kuiper, that's KUYPER.org/books. And if you look for it, there'll be a page you can click on. And at the bottom of that page, there is a button you can click which says download PDF. And you can download that free of charge. It goes into it in more detail than I've been able to go into it today. And it gives references to theologians and historians who have said, that this started out, this was the meal. There was no distinction between the what they call the Eucharist and the meal. It was the Lord's Supper was the meal, but the Eucharist became the thanksgiving with the bit of bread and wine, and the meal got neglected in the end. And I think that if we want to really be doing what Christ told us to do, we need to restore this, because churches, well, let's say we should be community. It's not about ritual, it's about being a community that lives out the principles of the kingdom of God, and by that models true society to the world. And this is a really important part of it. It is the central ritual of the Christian faith. If we're going to use that word ritual, I don't like it, but if we're going to use that word ritual, the Agape Feast, sorry, I can't get into the habit of saying Agape Feast. The Agape Feast is a central ritual of the Christian faith, in the sense that's what we're to do when we meet together. I know we have baptism, that's important as well, but we're to do this as often as we meet together. And this really helps us to really become a community together. So that's what I've got to say. You can now shoot me down in flames, or make comments, or ask questions, whatever you want to do.
Jason, can you turn the recording off?
You can, if you want to turn the recording off, do. That's fine.